Louis XIV ruled France from 1643 to 1715. He is considered the greatest monarch of his age and the best representation of absolutism. But I want you to consider whether he really upheld the principles of absolutism in his reign. One argument is that he basically just outlived all of his opponents. So his 72-year reign is the longest in European history, although Queen Elizabeth II of the United Kingdom within the next 4 or 5 years may surpass him. So one of the ways in which he was able to exercise his influence was to impose his personality upon the Kingdom of France. And so there is an argument to be made that he didn't really create an absolutist structure of government, more that he was able to just dominate it through his personality. One of the key mechanisms that he used to dominate Versailles, or to dominate France, was to establish his seat of government in Versailles. So we're going to look at Versailles as a vehicle to understand Louis XIV's domination of France and his attempt to create an absolutist form of government there. So this is the Chateau of Versailles. It was originally a hunting lodge used by Louis XIII, and then of course it was made much grander by Louis XIII, and then Louis XIV expanded it. So one of the early memories, in fact maybe his earliest memory of Louis XIV, was the Fronde Rebellion. So keep in mind that Louis's reign coincided with the last few years of the 30 Years' War, and so France was fighting multiple enemies, but particularly Spain, and it enacted high taxes, which angered a lot of people across the country. There was also fear that there was foreign influence in the government because Cardinal Mazarin, who was basically acting as the regent or the monarch in place of Louis XIV, was from Italy, and the fear was he was enacting policies that were more beneficial to Italy and perhaps the Catholic Church than in France. Also, nobles in the countryside and the provinces were dissatisfied with a lot of the centralization policies that had been enacted prior to this. So the Fronde Rebellion started in Paris, but then it expanded to the countryside. And one of Louis's earliest memories when he was 5 years old was being spirited out of the city of Paris with an angry mob threatening to kill him and his family. And so he decided to place his seat of government in a suburb of Versailles, which, if you've been to it, is about 15 miles train ride outside of the city of Paris. By the way, during the time that Versailles was constructed, the legend is that they burned the records of how much it cost because they didn't want the French people to know how much revenue was being absorbed from the wealth of the country to go toward this amazing palace for their monarch. But estimates run as high as 60 to 80% of government revenues during the time that Versailles was being built were essentially for Versailles. And so obviously that would cause a good deal of controversy with how expensive this building was. But it was absolutely essential to Louis's domination of the court culture that he was able to create there. So he could be away from the Parisian mobs at his stage of Versailles, because that's really what it was. It was a stage for the enactment of the play of absolutism. This is the famous Hyacinthe Rigaud portrait of Louis XIV. It's probably the most famous portrait, although, of course, there are many. I want to just add that you probably know that Louis created the French Academy of Sciences to promote interest in scientific and technological innovation, which, of course, would help the French state with navigation, military technologies. But Louis also created a French Academy of Arts, and so artists were patronized by the state, and of course their goal was to glorify France, to glorify Louis XIV, particularly by connecting him with gods and goddesses from the past. The whole idea of the Sun King is that everything revolves around him. By the way, there are very strict rules of how you had to paint and sculpt and create buildings, and so this is one of those kind of paintings that, of course, would have been patronized directly by the state to glorify Louis XIV. So you'll notice he has a sword, which is a sign of his, interest in warfare. We'll talk about that more in just a little bit. You notice he's also wearing high heels, which might strike you as being a little odd. Some people at the time might have thought of that as being somewhat effeminate. He wore high heels because he was below average in height, and he did not want to be that much shorter than the people around him, so he wore high heels, which of course became much more fashionable for women in subsequent centuries. He's also wearing tights, which we would again thought of as like, women women wear nylons, but he actually was quite proud of his athletic legs. So this is supposed to be a sign of virility. So you see the fleur de lis, which is on his robe. That's a symbol of the French monarchy, and the white in the background is also as well. So this is supposed to glorify him by associating him with power and glory and all of the little symbols and signs that say, I'm in charge. All right, so this is the gateway as you enter Versailles. So it has a giant courtyard. Again, you can see the symbols of absolutism. There's a lot of gold inlay that you'll find all across Versailles. This, of course, is once again to emphasize the greatness of the French state and the power and wealth that it possesses. So this is the courtyard where you would first enter into Versailles. This is a comment on the style of art. So this can be confusing. This is the great age of Baroque art. So Baroque art really starts with the Counter-Reformation in the beginning of the 17th century and stretches all the way to the middle of the 18th century. And it was particularly strong in Catholic countries, but especially countries like Spain, Italy, Austria, the Spanish Netherlands. And so the grandeur and the scale of Versailles could accurately be described as Baroque. But the Baroque style, in terms of a lot of its subject matter, the extreme religiosity never really took root in France. Louis XIV preferred to have classical references, as we'll see from the inside of Versailles, to Greek and Roman gods and goddesses and stories and themes from that. So it would be fair to say that Versailles is Baroque in some ways, but also neoclassical, because that is the style that the French monarchy wanted to deliberately promote. All right, so this is an equestrian statue of Louis XIV. Important to just show him on horseback. During his first few wars, mostly against the Dutch, because he resented their commerce, and they were kind of upstarts because they were Protestant and they were a smaller country with less population. He led his actual troops in battle, and he wanted to symbolize his power and influence by getting on a horse and demonstrating that he was able to do that, to lead his troops into battle. So, of course, he had sculptors produce this. I just want to remind you also that horse racing is called the sport of kings. So usually a thoroughbred racehorse, and by the way, they're all descended actually from 3 horses that were captured from the Ottoman Empire. England became the proponent of creating horse racing as an entire culture. But racing horses or riding horses was something that really only the nobility could afford to do. There were draft horses, big heavy horses, of course, which carried carts that peasants had, but these are considered to be thoroughbred racehorses. So this would be, again, a sign of his greatness. So Louis XIV was a committed Catholic. He certainly wasn't as pious as Philip II. He did get into conflicts with the papacy. He wasn't because he embraced unorthodox doctrines. It was really more the issue that went back to the Middle Ages, control of the clergy within France. And so he had even his clergy write up a statement of almost independence called the Declaration of Gallican Liberties, but he was he and the Pope were able to iron out their differences, so there was certainly no split there. Also, there was a supposed heresy within the Catholic Church called Jansenism, which is very strong in France. This was a movement in which, in the debate between Jesuits and Calvinism about the question of free will, Jansenists tended to embrace the Calvinist view that human beings had no control over their own salvation, which kind of ran against the Jesuit influence, which was in every country, at least Catholic countries, and that included France. So Louis did go to chapel. He did go to church regularly. Often he started his day with this. One of his other religious policies that is very important is in 1685, he decided to revoke the Edict of Nantes, which from 1598 had given Huguenots the right to worship freely. So it's really it's not unclear why he did this, but it's actually quite a simple reason. Huguenots were not necessarily posing a direct threat to the state. They weren't leading an uprising. He did this because he believed in one king, one faith, one law, and the very existence of a minority religion seemed to him to threaten not just the religious unity of France, but also the political and legal unity of the country. So he just resented the fact that there was this minority group that had a legal status that didn't fit in with the general culture of France. And so even though they were prohibited from immigrating, many of the Huguenots decided to emigrate to places like the Netherlands, Prussia, and also the colonies in North America. So most people would say this is one of the biggest mistakes that he made during his reign, because he deprived France of a lot treasury of a lot of its money, and engaged in debts and costly conflicts. And many of these wars were long and drawn out. Warfare during this time period involved standing armies, so it wasn't the destructive warfare of the age of religious warfare, but it was expensive nonetheless, and a lot of armies just spent a lot of time in the field just maneuvering around. Louis also had a series of fortresses built with his military engineer named Vauban on the border between the Holy Roman Empire and France. So the wars were really expensive, and they often degenerated into sieges, and there were 1690s in particular were a bad decade, which had crop failures and famines and high taxes and the beginnings of some murmurings, if not an organized revolt, then just some dissatisfaction with Louis's reign. So the first two wars were mostly against the Dutch. He even got the English to support him in that second war against the Dutch, and he was able to gain some territory on his northeastern frontier. His main two goals in these wars was essentially because he wanted to be the arbiter of Europe. He wanted to be the top political figure in Europe and deciding the destiny of the rest of Europe. Second, he believed that France should be able to extend to its natural frontiers, which would be the Rhine River, which would take him into the Spanish Netherlands, which, keep in mind, is still Catholic and still Spanish. To its north is the Dutch Republic, but also into the Holy Roman Empire. All right, so this is the Apollo room. Apollo is the god of poetry, the god of light or reason. Guess who that's face is on the god Apollo there, riding his chariots up into heaven. That's the face of Louis XIV. So, of course, he's associating himself with the classical past, like he's the culmination, the fulfillment of maybe the Roman Empire, maybe these ideals of citizenship and politics during this time period, and also just that he's, a great, almost demigod in the tradition of the Greek and Roman gods. So this is the war room. This is right off the Hall of Mirrors, which you can see down the hallway. And this is where he might meet with his advisors. So the main advisor of war during his reign was a guy named Michel de Tellier, or the Marquis de Louvois. And France at the time had the largest army, approximately 400,000 men. So standing armies were expensive. You had to outfit them, you had to train them, you had to feed them, and you had to supply them with weaponry. And so warfare was a very expensive endeavor. The other two wars that were significant is in 1689, Louis decided to invade the Holy Roman Empire to gain territory on his eastern border. This would eventually gain him what's called Franche-Comté, or today what we know as Alsace-Lorraine. And so this began the continuous rivalry between what later became Germany and France over Alsace-Lorraine. This war was called the 9 Years' War. That's the one that ended in the 1690s with great expense and sieges. And then the most important of his wars was the War of Spanish Succession, which began in 1701 because the last Habsburg ruler, Charles II, who had been inbred for about 6 or 7 generations, was unable to produce a male heir. He was hardly able to chew his food. He was considered to be mentally defective. He was sterile. And so when he died, he decided to leave his a will where his territory should go, and he left almost everything to Louis's grandson, Philip, who later became Philip V, the Bourbon monarch of Spain. And so at the same time, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was of course a Habsburg just like Charles, also was married into the family, and they wanted to press their claim as well. So this led to a giant war between France and Spain on one side, with Philip V, the grandson of Louis XIV, pressing his claims to be the Spanish king, and the Holy Roman Emperor with pretty much everyone else on his side trying to stop Louis from dominating politics. So this is where we really see that balance of power idea, is because Louis is the major threat to the balance of power, the other countries of Europe are going to go to the other side of the scale to weigh down his efforts to become the dominant power. Okay, so this is the most famous room at Versailles. It's called the Hall of Mirrors. For obvious reasons. So on the left-hand side, it's just got a row of mirrors, and on the right-hand side, it goes out to the courtyard or the grounds of Versailles. So this would be where big festivities would happen. So Louis began the whole tradition of really long meals with multiple courses, and so people would come in and they would bring in the dishes. And this is where you get the beginnings, really, of the great French culinary tradition. So when later on Versailles was dismissed as the seat of the monarchy when France became a republic, is these chefs, and there were hundreds of them, had no place to go. So they began opening up these restaurants in and around Paris, France, where they had mastered the fine art of culinary skills. So rather than just producing peasant food, stews and breads and things like that, they would produce multiple course meals where there was almost like this effort to overcome the constraints of nature and create the most tasty and elaborate dish. And there was a very sophisticated book of etiquette that you had to master when you came to Versailles. And everybody wanted to be at Versailles. It was a little bit like somebody who wants to be famous, maybe in acting or finance, moves to New York City because it's the center of these areas, and they live in like a really crappy studio apartment that costs $3,200 a month, and they live in poverty almost because they just want to be at the center of action. So there were a lot of different apartments in Versailles where nobles could come, and that's exactly what Louis wanted to do. He wanted to bring them to Versailles to involve them in court etiquette so they were not off in the provinces out in the countryside causing discontent and leading rebellions against him or just simply asserting their own local power. So Louis used the intendant system just like his grandfather Louis XIII did, which was a system of local officials who ensured that these laws and rules were being followed. All right. So one of the evening festivities would be called appartement. Appartement was the fancy dinner, and then in the evening, depending on what time it was, there would be some kind of activities to amuse people and engage them in, court etiquette and court leisure. And so for men, that might be playing billiards. It could be hunting. Hunting was really big. That was an important part of asserting your noble privilege, is the ability to run across the countryside, maybe sometimes over the crops of other people, and hunt down big game. For women, it might be playing cards, or they might be, in drawing rooms, and the stereotype was gossiping about court happenings, like who was having an affair with whom. The other thing is, if you were at Versailles, you didn't knock on the door because that was considered obtrusive. If there was a closed door and you weren't sure what was happening, you'd scratch your fingernail on the door to be much more discreet. Okay, so this is called the Peace Room. It's called the Peace Room because this is where the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, ending World War I, was signed. Okay, so of course, Versailles at the time was not a royal palace because France was not a monarchy. It was a republic, the Third Republic specifically. Of course, the German delegates did not want to sign this treaty. It was pretty much basically sign this or we will continue to have a blockade against your country and starve you to death. And so the two officials of the Weimar Republic were, of course, very dissatisfied, but they did eventually sign the treaty. So this is the Queen's bedchamber. The King and the Queen did not sleep together generally, unless they had business to conduct, if you know what I mean. Louis had 4 wives, not all at the same time. Again, he lived quite long, so he outlived 3 of his wives until he married his 4th wife. He did also have mistresses, so this is not the first time a king has had mistresses, but he was pretty blatant about it. He basically just thought that was part of his royal prerogative. In fact, many other monarchs across Europe imitated him. It was said that Frederick William I of Prussia, who really did love his wife and was a pretty strict Calvinist, also took on a mistress just so he could imitate Louis XIV in this. So this, by the way, is in the style more of the Rococo, which is this really elaborate creams and golds and heavy use of paint, lots of curves, and really kind of like a lush environment, almost like you're walking into a lush forest. So you can see a lot of different artistic styles that go through Versailles as if you were to visit both the interior and the grounds. By the way, the 3rd wife of Louis XIV was Madame de Maintenon. She had actually been his mistress prior to this, and so when his 2nd wife died, he married Madame de Maintenon, who was kind of controversial because it was believed that women behind the scenes had undue influence in court. So when we see later on with Marie Antoinette and some of the concerns about female influence, the fear was that it wasn't part of the regular system or structure of government, and then it involved this kind of use of sexuality or the use of backdoor dealings to try to influence policy. Well, anyways, Madame de Maintenon, when she became the new queen, she actually interviewed the women who would be the new mistresses for King Louis XIV. All right, so this is, of course, later. This is there's obviously a lot of artwork at Versailles. This is the coronation of Napoleon crowning Josephine, his wife, as the Empress of France. So this would be in 1804, and of course the Pope is in the background. You can see he was invited to the scene. Napoleon changed his mind at the last minute and decided that he would crown himself the emperor because he didn't want to signify that the church had power over and above him. So this is called the Battle Gallery. And of course, like I said, France was involved in nearly continuous warfare during Louis's reign. And so here, essentially, you have like busts and paintings of great military victories. All right. So one could joke that in French history, there haven't been a lot of great military victories in the last 100 years or so. One other thing I wanted to add, one of Louis's main advisors, I already mentioned the Marquis de Louvois, but the more important person is Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Colbert was the Minister of Finance, so he essentially helped create a mercantilist system of government. It was already pre-established by Louis's predecessors, but essentially the goal here was to use government policies and finance to essentially bring in money and revenue from both within the country and from without of the country, and try to prevent the intrusion of other countries into French colonies and also into French interests. So mercantilist policy presupposed a scarcity of resources and meant the government was going to be very involved in economic affairs. So it's not a laissez-faire system, which would be coming later with Adam Smith in the 18th century. In fact, Adam Smith's ideas are a critique of this. So Colbert served as the main minister until the 1680s when he died, but essentially he basically gave Louis XIV the means that he needed to conduct his wars and his other policies financially. Colbert also tried to create an internal free market, not a free market, but a consistent market within France by lowering tariffs, because France had a history of a patchwork of different provinces that had different taxing levels and also had their own rules and regulations for trade with other provinces. And Colbert worked to make that much more centralized, as you would imagine. They were called the farms, the farmers general, which also became the group of people who collected the taxes. All right, so this is the king's bedchamber. This is actually where Louis died. And so when he died in 1715, which is a date you should remember, which is the year after his last great war, the War of Spanish Succession, ended in 1714, he called to his bedside his successor, his great-grandson. He had outlived his sons and his grandsons, except for Philip V, who had become the king of Spain. And this would be the future Louis XV. So he said to his heir, "I fear that I have loved war too much," which is a warning to Louis XV, don't get involved in as many wars as I did, which is ironic because Louis XV completely ignored that advice and set the stage for the French Revolution. Well, they both did, by essentially setting up almost a near bankruptcy of the treasury. So everything that Louis did was invested with great ceremony and solemnity. The idea was to reinforce that he was almost a godlike figure, and just to make him almost like a celebrity. Everybody was looking at everything that Louis did, whether it was eating, and he's raising his fork to his face, and I wonder if he really likes it. By the way, back to the eating, Louis basically standardized utensils. So the idea of a fork and a knife and a spoon, some of those utensils that existed before, not the fork, and so Louis just regularized that there would be an extensive set of utensils for the appropriate behavior. And the idea is when you're eating with the king, you should take your seat at the table that's appropriate to your station in life. And the worst thing that can happen is Louis calls you out and says, "You don't belong there at this seat, you should go over to this seat." So there's famous stories of people at the court who said or did something embarrassing and just left the country and were not heard from again, or came back almost decades later. So when the king went to bed, there was a ceremony called the coucher, where nobles would actually vie for the right to give him his nightshirt to put him to bed. And then when he woke up, it was called the lever, and he would just basically be awakened by a group of people the same way. So everything, whether it was leisure or eating or sleeping, was a ceremony at the court. All right, so Louis XV became the king in 1715 upon Louis XIV's death. He reigned until 1774. He basically reigned for almost 60 years. He was replaced by Louis XVI, who of course was the king during the French Revolution, and who, along with his wife Marie Antoinette, were executed by the French revolutionaries. Louis XV was not a very good king. He was rather lazy. Unlike Louis XIV, who did attend to the affairs of state regularly, Louis XV was much more interested in just his mistresses and hunting. So this is another example of Rococo style of art. So it is said that Louis was so lazy, Louis XV, that if you notice those French doors there, that he would just sit on the couch in this study with his shotgun for hunting, and they would basically just force peasants to like drive the game directly in front of his window so he could shoot them almost like it was a video game. So again, tells you that he was not very successful. So absolutism is predicated on a strong, energetic king, and when you don't have that, obviously the state can drift and you can have other forces reassert themselves. All right, so this is Louis XVI library. So this is more neoclassical, cleaner, neater, straighter lines. And so Louis XVI became the king in 1774. He and his wife at first were very popular. They were a young couple who really seemed to be in love. Louis XVI was basically a good family man. He was religious, but he just did not have an ounce of political skill. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And even though he made some efforts to try to reform the French state and its financial system, he just was unable to navigate his way through the contested political environment. And then during the French Revolution, he seemed to like almost make everything worse by what he decided to do. All right, so one of the major entertainments was opera. So this is the great age of opera. It's considered to be by some the total art form because it involves literature, because you have to have the libretto or the play. It involves music. It involves creating sets like this one, which is both architecture and sculpture and painting. And so it was considered to be the highest sophisticated form of culture. So Louis would often attend the opera. By the way, this is the great age of like French playwrights, Molière, Racine, and basically they would write a lot of plays mostly about classical themes. Sometimes they'd integrate like contemporary French themes. They might even take mild little jokes about Versailles culture, but they certainly wouldn't like have like really hardcore satire like South Park or Family Guy about Louis XIV. There's another view of the opera house, so you can imagine the king having the best box seat over on the left-hand side. Notice the Sun King emblem above the stage there. All right, so now we go outside, and we just look at the grounds of Versailles are really vast, and this is larger than any private residence, of course, that you would encounter in the United States, and the facade there could literally be a mile. So a lot of it was based on the new understanding of hydraulics, which was part of the scientific revolution, and you'll see a lot of amazing fountains. This is called the South Parterre, which is just an area. Notice how controlled the garden is, all right? So again, this is a little bit like almost like Edward Scissorhands as your gardener, if you're familiar with that. Like everything is geometrically shaped and controlled, which is a sign, of course, of the state's control over its subjects. Louis liked to have fresh oranges. These would be brought inside during the winter months. There would be a greenhouse, so he could have fresh orange juice. I guess it's good to be the king. A lot of this is, of course, is based on trade with other areas of the world. France doesn't naturally produce citrus fruits. And then here you have the Grand Canal. So that can't really tell from the angle, but that's about a 1.5 mile canal. And sometimes they would engage in like mock battles. There were 4 or 5 times during Louis's reign where all of the great monarchs of Europe were invited to like a major festivity, maybe to celebrate one of his military victories. And of course, you can imagine like all the people who would just be thrilled that it could be very contemporary idea of like a famous actor or a sports figure inviting a bunch of people to their amazing mansion with their jet and their helicopter, and everybody's just thrilled to be there. And they could say, I was there, I met this person, fill in the blank, LeBron James. And so this is like the same idea, as everybody wanted to be around Louis XIV's court culture just because they wanted to say that they were there. It doesn't mean everybody liked him. It doesn't mean that they didn't oppose his diplomatic designs. But you can see the canal there was to like not only stage mock battles, but also as like another sense of controlling nature and to bring people in from the outside via water transportation. And then you have all these fountains. So this is called the Latona Fountain. And they're all seemingly named after figures from the classical past. And there's the Apollo Fountain, back to the theme of Apollo. We saw that before with the interior. And then the Neptune Fountain. Neptune is the god of the sea. France certainly had a navy, and they did contest with Great Britain. This is during the great age of the rivalry between Great Britain and France, which really starts with the 9 Years' War, also known as the War of the League of Augsburg, which is also when William III, who was the Stadtholder of Holland, also became the King of England. So from 1689 to basically 1815, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, you basically had like an over-century rivalry between the two countries. And France did have colonies that contested with the British in North America, in India, and other places, the Caribbean. But generally, Great Britain had the stronger outside of the grounds of Versailles, there was actually like a little mini palace that was developed later. It's called the Grand Trianon. So this is the exterior of that. Again, it also looks much more neoclassical. And this is the King's Chamber in the Grand Trianon, very similar to outside. So you can see the Corinthian columns. So again, this is a little bit more of a neoclassical artistic style. And this is the gallery. So along here would be, of course, paintings and rooms where people could live at Versailles. All right, so this is more amusing. Marie Antoinette, who was, of course, Austrian, her mother was Maria Theresa of Austria. She came to Versailles and just grew somewhat bored with court culture. So she had her, ladies in waiting around her. So one of the things she wanted to do was build a hamlet. So this is a little peasant-type village, of course, a really nice one. And basically she and her ladies in waiting would dress up like milkmaids or like little peasant girls and, whatever, dance around. They even painted cows like pink and purple. Marie Antoinette was famous for her like gigantic hairstyles that went up to multiple tiers. She was also going to be sexually promiscuous, rumors of her having relations with people behind the king's back and the way she dressed. And so this just brought more scandal to the monarchy, particularly the whole court culture behind it. And this is another view of the cute little hamlet. Okay, so I just want to end here, as this is the last slide, just by reminding you that absolutism is not the same as totalitarianism, which is a term associated with the 20th century, the post-World War I period. Absolutism just means that the king has absolute or final authority on matters that are considered to be essential to governing. These would be matters like taxes, financing, budget, administration, law, warfare, diplomacy, maybe to some degree religion, but not everything that a subject thinks or does. Totalitarianism is different. Totalitarianism is the complete and total control of every facet of life by the government, and it's predicated on having modern communications and transportation technologies to enable that to happen. Really, you have to have mass politics first, which is born in the French Revolution, to be able to have totalitarianism. So basically, Louis was more interested in passive obedience, whereas a totalitarian dictator like Mussolini or Hitler or Stalin would be interested much more in enthusiastic, fanatical dedication to the state, and able to marshal people to do obviously horrible things like genocide, or to commit all kinds of atrocities in behalf of the state. So Louis XIV never did create, in some ways, an absolutist state. He basically, essentially, if the French state that he inherited was like an old desk, rather than building a new desk from scratch that was much sturdier and more stable and had a much clearer design principle, Louis just basically opened up a big can of shellac, which is like a painting surface to make something shiny, and just poured it over the table to make it really appealing and glittering, but never really dismantled the French state. So the person who really did dismantle the French state and create a new, more centralized, rationalized state, well, it started with the French Revolution, but that would be really Napoleon who completed that process. So anyways, Versailles, just the final word, is the place where Louis enacted this drama of absolutism, however you view absolutism, whether it was fulfilled or not fulfilled by Louis XIV.